Hi. So I'm Mary, obviously, and my co-author Albert couldn't make it, so I'll be presenting on our behalf. And just before I begin, Ross actually asked me yesterday how Albert and I came to collaborate and kind of do this project together, and I think it's actually really important to talk about. So in our sort of file sharing and sharing of articles, Albert and I realized that we were working towards the same thing and coming to similar conclusions. So rather than try to do that on our own and potentially compete with one another, we decided to just join forces. And the result is an ongoing collaboration. And this paper that I'm presenting sort of provides a report on that continuous examination of the relationships of the Eastern Polynesian languages. And primarily, this talk will offer some new perspectives and present evidence for how linguistic features were shared between these languages. So what I'll first do is take us just quickly through the Eastern Polynesian languages and the brief history of their interpretations, the interpretations of their grouping and their development, and then I'll present our new interpretation of their internal relationships. And finally, I'll address some important implications of our new analysis. Okay, sorry, this is a bit funny. So as you all know, or likely know, the Polynesian languages are those spoken in the light blue areas, which cover a vast area of the oceanic linguistic space in the Pacific. This big blue area, which we know is commonly referred to as the Polynesian Triangle, includes about 30 languages, 30 Polynesian languages. And the majority of this light blue space is towards the east, is, lo and behold, containing the Eastern Polynesian languages. Within the Eastern Polynesian group, there are two very well-defined proto-languages, Proto-Polynesian and Proto-East Polynesian. Both Proto-Polynesian and Proto-Eastern Polynesian are very well defined by large sets of lexical innovations, as well as by significant sound changes that have been laid out since the 60s by Roger Green and, of course, Andy Pauly and Jeff Mark. However, the rest of this tree is kind of under a little bit of debate. We've got a tree here that's basically based on Jeff Mark's work. In 2000, we had the funny Samoic outlier comment that we saw in Ross's talk. And as Ross's talk showed us, there's still continual discussion on where things fall within the Polynesian language family. But what we're going to focus today on is one particularly fuzzy branch, which is Proto-Eastern Polynesian. Okay. So the linguistic subgrouping of the Eastern Polynesian languages, first published by Roger Green in 1966, and represented here by this tree from Jeff Mark's seminal Topics in Polynesian Culture History in 2000. This was the standard representation of affinities among Eastern Polynesian languages for about 60 years. This tree essentially implies that from Proto-Eastern Polynesian, there was a first division between Easter Island and a Central Eastern Polynesian subgroup, and then a division of Central Eastern Polynesian into two subgroups, Marquesic and Tahitic, with Marquesic including Marquesan, the Marquesan languages or Marquesan varieties, Mangarevan and Hawaiian, and then essentially with Tahitic including all of the other ones except for all of the other East Polynesian languages except for Rapa Nui. In 2014, I presented evidence against this subgrouping, and I proposed a new EP tree, Eastern Polynesian tree, that retained of course, the Central Eastern Polynesian subgroup based on compelling evidence and compelling shared features, but a tree that ultimately eliminated the Tahitic and Marquesic subgroups. This new tree did similar things to the previous tree, show that Rapa Nui separated from all of the other Eastern Polynesian languages, implying, yet again, that it did develop in some isolation. Pilla Wilson's very recent paper discussing the northern outliers and Eastern Polynesian, he makes a small comment claiming that his interpretation of the Eastern Polynesian languages, he claims that two sporadic sound innovations actually permit the maintenance of the Marquesic and the Tahitic subgroups. These two sound innovations are these here. He doesn't discuss it really at length, but I'm sort of gathering which sound corresponds, which sound changes he meant, and to which proto-language he meant, based on a few different points in that paper. But essentially, the two features are first Blenny, which underwent a sporadic sound change from Proto-Eastern Polynesian Panoko to Proto-Marquesic Paroko. And then the second, which would be an argument for Proto-Tahitic, is a sporadic sound change from Proto-Eastern Polynesian Kaviti to Proto-Tahitic Kohiti. So now it's not a whole lot of evidence, but it is, to him, some evidence. But I will just go ahead and refute these. Neither of these innovations actually hold. So the sporadic sound change of N to R in Blenny is indeed shared by Rapa Nui, so it cannot be an argument for Proto-Marquesic. And Kohiti is found in Hawaiian, so a distinctly non-typical Tahitic language, under the Tahitic and Marquesic sort of paradigm. So we have a lot of different interpretations, and all of these former interpretations of the Eastern Polynesian languages were based on what's pretty clear to be a limited selection of languages using pretty limited source material. Often only the so-called major languages of this area, Tahitian, Hawaiian, Maori, Rarotongan, Mangareva, and Rapa Nui were included. And so that doesn't include a whole lot of other languages. And the reason for that is mostly because we just didn't have data, and or older sources were just not very readily available. So with newly available resources, such as the new Cook Islands dictionaries online and our respective field data between Albert and I from Mangareva, Rapa Nui, and Rapa Iti, as well as a lot of 19th century and 20th century sources that have been sort of rediscovered and digitized and made more readily available. Some of these include Churchill, 1912, and Roussel, 1926 for Rapa Nui, providing really, really valuable data for an older form of Rapa Nui. Jeannot, 1908 for Mangareva, and then Stimson's notes for some of the Austral Islands, notably for Raivavai. These all allow us to have a lot more information and do a lot better comparison between the EP languages. And it sort of requires us to do this reinterpretation, right? So I will say that I suspect that what we are presenting today and what we continue to work on is not the final word at all. There are still lots of languages that we need more data for, and hopefully, as we'll see on Thursday with Jacques Renardon's talk, some increase in data for even the Tuamotu dialects and Tuamotu languages. So returning to the tree, what we're left with after all of that is just a rake that doesn't really tell us much about the detailed and actual relationships between these languages. And it certainly doesn't do any justice to the actual shared developments that do occur between them and do exist between them. And shared innovations do certainly exist between these languages. However, the issue, and maybe why it becomes a rake, is that these shared innovations and shared features are often limited to only a handful of languages. And what's more, most languages participate in multiple and overlapping networks of innovation. At the Historical Linguistics Conference in July, just a few months ago, I proposed that in subgrouping the Eastern Polynesian languages, we should appeal to a network-based understanding of their development, suggesting the elimination of interstage proto-languages under Proto-Eastern Polynesian. And I'll be elaborating on that today, describing the diversification of the Eastern Polynesian languages through at least 3 overlapping networks that Albert and I have identified. There are likely more, but these are the 3 most important that we've identified so far. These are the Central Eastern Polynesian Network, which is, it's hard to make an oval without covering all of East Polynesia. So this is not to be two different networks, but one network including all of those languages. A Southeastern Polynesian network, and then the one that just came before to the right, far east, is MMR, which is Mangarevan, Marquesan, and Rapa Nui. For lack of a better word, we just chose to use a descriptive term. Moving to the Central Eastern Network, this is a network that includes all of the languages of Eastern Polynesia except for Rapa Nui, so Hawaiian, the Tuamotuan languages, the Marquesan languages, Mangareva, Southern Cook languages, Tongareva, Tahitian, and the languages of the Austral Islands. And again, we need to keep in mind that some of the data for the Austral Islands and also for the Tuamotuan varieties is limited, so again, we'll need to pay more attention to this when more data becomes available. What is fairly obvious is that this is a massive network that includes a relatively very large number of languages when we think about the number of languages that actually exist and that are Eastern Polynesian languages. Additionally, it includes multiple smaller spheres of interaction and several instances of innovations between just pairs of languages and varying sets of different languages. So what we'll focus on today are not every single one of these sets and pairs of languages and the innovations between them, but what we'll focus on for defining this network today are the most widespread innovations of this network, meaning that all or most of the member languages participate in them, and choosing to select those that were determined by Green and Mark and others to be the defining innovations for what was a Central Eastern Polynesian subgroup. So we'll just focus on those very sort of marked shared innovations. Presented here just quickly are the consonant inventories, so the reflexes and sound correspondences of some of the Eastern Polynesian languages, these being the Central Eastern Polynesian languages. Moving to the innovations, there are 5. We have the one regular sound change, the sequence in Proto-Eastern Polynesian of FAF became in the Central Eastern Polynesian languages, Va, and this is attested in all of the languages except for Rapa Iti. Rapa Iti, keep in mind, does have, has sort of lots and lots and lots of innovations in both its basic lexicon and in other areas of its lexicon due to probably word tapu. So it's possible that a pre-Rapa Iti might have had this, but we'll never know. So we just have to say that all but Rapa Iti attest this change. Then we have 3 sporadic sound changes, chu, ngau, becoming ngahu. This doesn't occur in all of them, but it does occur in quite a few. In Hawaiian, the Marquesan varieties, Tahitian, Tuamotuan, and Mangarevan. Sharp, kai to koi, and that occurs in all of them, so it's very strong. Hu is a sporadic sort of change. Proto-Eastern Polynesian I becomes a vai in all but Mangarevan and Marquesan. And then there, that aforementioned place is a grammatical word innovation, essentially part of the lexicon, reira, and that occurs in all of them. So now moving to the Southeastern Polynesian Network, which I first identified in 2017. This stretches from Mangareva in the east to the Southern Cook Islands in the west. And the languages that participate in this network are Rapa Iti, Mangareva, and the languages of the Southern Cook Islands. This network needs more work, but it is primarily identified by shared regular sound changes, as demonstrated here. They are identical sound changes from Proto-Eastern Polynesian. Within the Southeastern Polynesian Network, there are further chain-like shared innovations between different pairs of languages. So we see, we don't see any shared innovations between all of them. Lexical innovations are sporadic sound change, but we do see sort of overlapping chain-like innovations between pairs of languages. So some examples of those chain-like innovations are between Rapa Iti and Mangareva. And I won't read them because I think I'm running quickly out of time, and Rapa Iti and Rarotongan. And there are others, but we're working on identifying them. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, because it is a new proposition, is the MMR network. So Mangareva, Marquesan, Rapa Nui network. And this is, of course, made up of Mangareva, the Marquesan varieties, and Rapa Nui. All languages, the innovations that we found for this, it's important to note that all three of the languages participate in all of the innovations. So what we have, and again, I won't go through all of these except for, I won't go through all of them, but I can return to this page, or I can talk with you about it at the coffee break. But what we see are three semantic innovations, so semantic shift, 3 sporadic sound changes, and about 6 lexical innovations at this point. And based on 3 more innovations shared only between Rapa Nui and Mangareva, we can observe sort of a split between what was maybe like a proto-Marquesan, a pre-Marquesan varieties, a split between that and Mangareva and Rapa Nui. And these are the 3 innovations for shared by Mangareva and Rapa Nui that attest to that. The most important of them being this sort of double sporadic sound change of that aforementioned from Proto-Eastern Polynesian tawa to tou. We also have grammatical extension for Proto-Eastern Polynesian tafanga, becomes, which meant something like clear, becomes a grammatical word meaning something like only or continuously in Mangareva and Rapa Nui. And then we just have one select lexical innovation. So why describe these as networks and not subgroups, right, like we normally would? And the answer is because there's so much overlapping of these innovations. And that doesn't allow us at all to make nice, clean subgroups. And of course, Malcolm has written extensively on these such occurrences in oceanic languages, defining them as linkages, where a group of languages are related and linked together by intersecting layers of innovations. So in this way, we might describe the Eastern Polynesian languages as perhaps a linkage. These situations are not easily represented by trees, as both Malcolm and Alex have demonstrated in numerous publications. And to quote Alex's 2014 paper on the ways in which languages develop and diversify, quote, trees fail to capture the very common situation in which linguistic diversification results from the fragmentation of a language into a network of dialects which remained in contact with each other for an extended period of time. And this is precisely the situation that we're seeing with the Eastern Polynesian languages. That being said, if Albert and I dare to put these networks into sort of a tree representation, please don't throw things at me. We might end up with, I don't even want to show it. No, we might end up with something like this. Terrible tree, where horizontal lines indicate transmission of innovations in the major networks. Again, this tree, please, should not be considered as a conclusion by any means. It shouldn't be considered as a challenge to how linkages and linkage situations should be represented, but rather it should be viewed as sort of a mere visual aid, okay? To help us describe these complex networks in space, because after all, this is a PowerPoint presentation and you need to see something in space. And it actually does a little bit more than that. This very ugly, unconventional tree also allows us to show the orders of innovations in that physical space, which is pretty important in this case. So what we see is that Proto-Eastern Polynesian split into 2 primary networks, MMR and CEP. Then after the Marquesan varieties separated, there is evidence for continued cohesion between Mangarevan and Rapa Nui. And after Rapa Nui and Mangareva split, both Marquesan and Mangareva then participated in innovations of the CEP network. And within this, we see also evidence for a smaller SEP network. And this allows us to demonstrate that the innovations shared between the CEP languages would have had to have happened after the separation of MMR and the separation of MR, as Rapa Nui does not participate in any of those CEP innovations. So during the period of the CEP and the SEP, Rapa Nui was no longer in continuous interaction with Eastern Polynesian languages or other Eastern Polynesian languages. So very quickly, I will go through the heavy implications of this, and we can definitely talk more about it because that's not enough time. So what does this imply about Eastern Polynesian prehistory? First, there was an early settlement of Proto-Eastern Polynesian speakers in Mangareva and the Marquesas. Because the Central Eastern Polynesian innovations occurred after Rapa Nui split off, it's clear that MMR and MR innovations developed earlier, right? So now there's no way to know where exactly those innovations were happening, and if we think it's in some sort of network, it could have been sort of anywhere, but somewhere between Mangareva, the Marquesas, and Rapa Nui. It had to have been there. But that's really as far as the linguistics lets us go. We can't really go further than that. But if we look to other disciplines, of course, if we look to archaeology, we can. And we find that Rapa Nui was settled at least 100 years after Mangareva and the Marquesas. And in fact, the earliest archaeological dates for Eastern Polynesia appear on Taravai, which is next to the island of Mangareva in the Gambier. And that's actually the picture from the first title slide. And the second earliest date, which is almost exactly at the same time, is in Hane in the Marquesas, thus allowing us to conclude that there were early Proto-Eastern Polynesian speaking peoples in Mangareva and the Marquesas. The second implication of all of this is that Rapa Nui was perhaps likely settled from Mangareva, and certainly did not develop fully in isolation as was previously thought. Rapa Nui's participation in MMR and the MMR and then the MR innovations implies that there was this sort of direction of settlement, and of course the archaeological dates contribute to that analysis. And if it wasn't settled from there, they at least remained, Mangareva and Rapa Nui at least remained in quite intensive and continued interaction for a little while. Third, Marquesan and Mangarevan were involved in early contact networks with the islands of the regions of Central East Polynesia. This is fairly obvious in the fact that the Marquesan varieties and Mangareva both participate in these Central East Polynesian innovations, and with Mangareva also participating in the Southeastern Polynesian network. And and perhaps maybe the most important of this is that these networks for future development and innovation spreading are the result of intense connectivity in the whole of the East Polynesian region. And this kind of language development is supported by the archaeological record that describes a rapid and multiple settlement situation, followed by high mobility between islands, facilitating continuous interactions between the early East Polynesians. I'll stop there because I've run out of time, but I can get into the archaeological evidence as well if you like. So that's me. I would like to say thank you to these people, and I really look forward to your feedback, especially from the chiefs of this morning that spoke before me. So thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Marie. Si vous avez 5 questions. Une question et demie pour commencer.
Would you like to tell us about the archaeological evidence?
Oh, sure. Would you like to hear about it? It's maybe let's see. Okay, let me find my notes. So there's lots.
I'm a little skeptical, before you say that, I'm a little skeptical about the notion of intense connectivity in the whole of the Eastern Polynesian language. That would include Easter Island, New Zealand, and Hawaii.
Yeah.
They're so far away from the center
They
that
are.
it's difficult to imagine there was intense contact between them, two-way contact.
Yeah.
after initial settlement.
Yeah, I think actually New Zealand is maybe the hardest one to prove. Rapa Nui, there are oral histories. There's a lot of oral histories between Mangareva and Rapa Nui. Te Rangihiroa, Peter Buck wrote extensively about this, talking about a possible settlement event, and people aren't sure if it's actually talking about Pitcairn or Rapa Nui, but there are oral histories that point to at least involvement and interaction between the two places. So there's that in the oral history record. In terms of the archaeological record, it does include Hawaii, going all the way to the Australs. Let me just find the sources here. Okay, so they've found a lot of evidence of raw materials that were passed between both local spheres and then, of course, these distant spheres. Hermit et al. In 2017 suggested that stone tools found in Tupuai in the Austral Islands were made from rock that was sourced 2,000 kilometers away in Eau in the Marquesas. And I know that they've found more of these kind of situations to be published soon. Cullerson and Weisler in 2007 provided evidence suggesting contact between Hawaii and the Tuamotus through tracing stone material and Tuamotuan tools to a distinctly Hawaiian origin. And they write in that paper also that these tools that they're talking about also indicate contact with the societies, the Marquesas, and the Australs. So if you're looking at a contact network between Hawaii and the Australs, that's a pretty long way. And already the Tuamotus and Hawaii are quite a long way, and there's significant linguistic data that Pilla's written about that shows definitely a network of innovations between the Tuamotus and Hawaii as well. And then Weisler in 1997 also provided evidence for long-distance interaction between using stone tools between Marquesan artifacts with the societies and Mangareva. And he writes that it clearly demonstrates long-distance inter-archipelago interaction that continued long after colonization. So that's 1998 and 1997. So that's the bulk of the other discipline evidence for that.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll have to, I don't know, I've read the Peter Buck, the oral histories, and I don't know the details of them just off the top of my head, but I can find them and we can definitely talk about those as well.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. Check.
Thank you, Marie, for this talk. I have just a mention in the Polex. There is a reconstruction level called XE,
Yep.
yes, Marquesan, Margaret Eastern Island. Can you
Yep.
tell me what the connection between your own work and the
Yep. So there's a lot of overlap. So that is, we have a few more, but certainly I think all but maybe one of the ones that Ross has put in there in Polex are overlapping. So it's, essentially supports more supporting evidence for what we're saying. Yeah. Paul, okay.
Okay, just 2 points. First, with respect to long-distance connections, just to remind everybody of Tupaya's map, which shows that he, at any rate, was familiar with Fiji, Rotuma, and the Marquesas, and pretty well all of Eastern Polynesia, but not Hawaii or New Zealand or Rapa Nui.
Yeah.
But he did say that his fathers and ancestors knew a lot more than he did. And then just a question, if I recall correctly, Oceanic Linguistics article by Stephen Fisher mentions that Mangareva, or at least a segment of the vocabulary of Mangareva, does not partake in the faf to wa sound change. What's your comment on that?
Yeah, so there's one. I was so encouraged by thinking that it didn't participate in it, but there's one, and it's va'o, I guess, for outside, and that's the only one. There's no, it's a'ine, and then there's a doublet from a probably later stage borrowing from a Marquesan variety that's ve'ine. So they have ve'ine and a'ine, but so doublets. But yeah, the va'o is, I can't get away from it. Yeah, it's still there no matter where I look. Yeah, thanks thanks for your question. Alex.
Thanks, Mary. So I wanted you to tell us and give us an idea of how much data there is that is not exploited yet by your study that would give us a leeway for more precision or more. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So you based your observation on a number of innovations. I don't know, mostly lexical, a bit of sound change. Would you say there's what would be your avenues of research for adding more data and consolidating or challenging the subgroups that are emerging?
Yeah. So I think in such a small area with languages that are so already closely together, the sporadic sound changes are really, really important. So that's why I sort of honed in on those. But yeah, we need a lot more data because a lot of those sporadic sound changes aren't happening in basic lexicon. So we need really good descriptive data. So the places where we need good descriptive data are more data, more historical data on the Cook Islands. There is some really good work coming out, but there's still some sort of gaps in the Cook Islands. And then what Jacques is working on and hopefully going to report is the big gap in the Tuamotuan varieties, which really need a lot of work. And Jacques is currently doing work there, and I'm excited to hear about that on Thursday. But I would say those would be the two. If there was a student who wanted to work in East Polynesia and was looking for a project, I would say go to those two places. Yeah. And the Australs too, I guess. Rurutu would be another one.